When a routine parliamentary committee hearing in Cape Town collapses into raw racial fury, it exposes a profound crisis within the state. Over 6 million voters watch as the machinery of oversight breaks down under the weight of unresolved historical trauma. The dignity of millions is tested when language from the colonial era surfaces inside the supreme legislative body. Standing at the center of this storm is Julius Malema, leading 44 lawmakers in a fiery confrontation against executive immunity and institutional neglect. This is not merely a clash between political parties. It is a struggle over the soul of a democratic nation. If power changes hands, but not structure, has anything really changed? Stay with us. This is far more than a passing headline. It is a critical turning point in the struggle for truth. If this story touches your commitment to justice, support our work with a comment and a subscription to ensure these crucial voices are never silenced. Welcome to South African Dynamics, where we examine the geopolitical shifts and institutional battles defining South Africa politics. Today, we dissect an extraordinary moment where executive privilege, racial hostility, and parliamentary law collided in plain view. Inside the virtual chambers of Cape Town's National Assembly, what began as a technical review of legislative procedure quickly transformed into a high-stakes constitutional standoff. The Parliamentary Committee convened to deliberate on Clause 11, a critical provision governing how the South African state summons intelligence operatives to provide sworn testimony before Parliament. At the heart of this technical debate lay a formidable apparatus, a national security infrastructure encompassing more than 39,000 security personnel and managing billions of rand in undisclosed operational funds. For decades, the mechanism for overseeing this vast state apparatus remained shielded behind bureaucratic opacity. Yet, as the committee gathered, the fundamental question was no longer about administrative procedure, but about who holds the ultimate authority to hold power accountable. Taking the floor with calculated precision, Julius Malema, leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, directed the committee's attention to what he characterized as a fatal conflict of interest embedded within the rule of law. Under the existing framework, any parliamentary request to subpoena senior officials from state security or crime intelligence required prior written permission from political principals, specifically the minister in the presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni. Malema argued that this requirement created an insurmountable structural contradiction. How could an investigative body demand transparency when the very politicians implicated in wrongdoing held the executive power to grant or withhold permission for witnesses to testify? In Malema's forceful assessment, asking an implicated minister for permission to release evidence was equivalent to granting institutional impunity. He insisted that the committee bypass political gatekeepers entirely, advocating instead that permission be sought directly from an independent magistrate or a high court judge. By making this demand, Malema sought to wrest control away from those who occupy the seat of power to protect their own political survival. This sharp intervention went far beyond routine parliamentary debate. It targeted the core architecture of post-apartheid governance. For years, executive dominance had allowed senior officials to operate within a protective shadow, using ministerial discretion as a shield against legislative scrutiny. Malema's argument laid bare the reality that when oversight relies on the consent of the powerful, accountability becomes an illusion. The seat of power in Pretoria had long dictated the boundaries of state security disclosures, leaving parliamentary committees powerless to investigate allegations of high-level corruption and intelligence misuse. By challenging Clause 11, Malema was not merely disputing a technical rule, he was attempting to dismantle a system of institutional self-protection that had shielded the executive branch for generations. As the debate grew increasingly tense, the fragile decorum of the committee shattered over a matter of parliamentary protocol. In laying out his argument, Malema referred to Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni simply by her first name, omitting her official title. This deliberate breach of legislative etiquette immediately drew the ire of Cameron Dugmore, a senior parliamentarian representing the Democratic Alliance. Rising on a point of order, Dugmore appealed directly to the committee chairperson, Kubudile Dianti, insisting that addressing a cabinet minister by her first name demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect and violated the long-standing conventions of Parliament. Dugmore argued that rules of decorum must be strictly enforced if the committee was to maintain its legitimacy and dignity in the eyes of the public. Yet what Cameron Dugmore viewed as a minor breach of parliamentary etiquette was to Julius Malema a calculated attempt to police his tone and distract from systemic executive corruption. Rather than offering a quiet retraction, Malema turned directly on his accuser, seizing upon Dugmore's intervention to launch an explosive counterattack that would shatter all parliamentary decorum and ignite an uncontainable racial confrontation inside the committee. As Cameron Dugmore demanded an immediate enforcement of parliamentary decorum, the atmosphere within the virtual committee meeting deteriorated from technical friction into an uncontainable ideological battle. Refusing to succumb to procedural chastisement, Julius Malema delivered an uncompromising counterstrike. Bypassing the conventional language of parliamentary diplomacy, Malema directly accused Dugmore of being a white supremacist and a racist, making explicit references to his physical appearance and skin tone. To outside observers, such personal attacks might appear as mere rhetorical excess or theatrical provocation. Yet in the fierce landscape of South African political analysis, Malema's confrontation was a calculated ideological maneuver. By launching this direct assault, the leader of the economic freedom fighters sought to strip away the polished facade of parliamentary respectability, arguing that formal decorum often serves to conceal deep-seated racial hierarchies that still linger 30 years after the fall of apartheid. In response, Cameron Dugmore attempted to defend his moral standing and anti-apartheid credentials by reminding the committee of his long history in the liberation movement. Dugmore noted that he was actively engaged in the struggle against minority rule, while Malema was still an unborn infant or a young child. However, this defensive appeal backfired, instantly triggering a far deeper socio-historical explosion. In invoking Malema's youth and referring to him as a child, Dugmore touched upon one of the most painful wounds in South Africa's collective memory. For generations under colonial rule and the Native Labour Regulation Act, adult black men were systematically stripped of their adult status and addressed as boy, a pervasive weapon of racial infantilization designed to deny black men their humanity, dignity, and authority. Before we reveal the next chapter, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of sovereignty you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member. Not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for South African Dynamics' mission. Every member becomes a co-creator of the revolution we are documenting. Join us. Stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. The historical resonance of Dugmore's phrasing sent shockwaves through the black members of the committee. Parliamentarians such as Marshall and Matumba rose in sharp protest, expressing profound discomfort at what they described as the reinscription of white supremacy within the supreme democratic institution of the land. They passionately argued that in the South African context, no white parliamentarian could be permitted to infantilize a black leader who represents over 6 million citizens and commands a revolutionary movement of more than 1 million active members. They accused Chairperson Kubudile Dianti of applying a double standard, demanding that Malema withdraw his comments while turning a blind eye to the historical insult directed at a black commander-in-chief. Faced with an escalating walkout threat and uncontrolled shouting, Malema offered a partial tactical retreat that only deepened the impasse. He agreed to withdraw the word racist, but steadfastly maintained his characterization of Dugmore as a white supremacist, asserting that such a term was factually accurate and fully constitutional under parliamentary rules. Unable to restore order or formulate an immediate legal remedy, Chairperson Dianti was forced to instruct the Secretariat to mute all microphones across the committee. The sudden silence over the digital stream did not signal resolution. It exposed a profound institutional breakdown. As the muted microphones hung in tense stillness, a dangerous question echoed through Parliament. Was this meltdown merely an isolated dispute over words? Or was it the first crack in a fragile political alliance that threatened to tear the national government apart? Inside the broader landscape of South Africa politics, the meltdown within the National Assembly is far from an isolated squabble over parliamentary decorum. Instead, it represents the visible eruption of deep structural fractures within the nation's political settlement. The formation of the Government of National Unity, a historic grand coalition aligning the African National Congress with the Democratic Alliance, effectively sidelined the economic freedom fighters, driving them into fierce parliamentary opposition by marginalizing a revolutionary political force that commands 44 legislative seats and represents more than 6 million voters. The governing alliance created an explosive pressure cooker inside Parliament. Julius Malema's militant posturing is not merely tactical political drama. It is a direct challenge to a coalition he views as an elite pact designed to preserve economic privilege. When millions of disenfranchised citizens feel that their political aspirations are excluded from executive decision-making, procedural decorum inside the chamber is no longer perceived as a neutral democratic standard, but as an instrument of political suppression. Beyond the marble corridors of power in Cape Town and Pretoria, this legislative crisis reflects a far more dangerous socio-economic reality. 30 years after the historic democratic elections of 1994 ended, formal minority rule South Africa remains defined by staggering levels of economic inequality. Government statistics and independent socio-economic reports paint a sobering picture. 10% of the population still controls over 80% of the national wealth, while youth unemployment sits at catastrophic levels across townships and rural provinces. When lawmakers engage in fierce shouting matches over accusations involving Julius Malema racist remarks and colonial-era insults, they are tapping into a reservoir of deep societal frustration. For millions of citizens living without basic services or economic security, the parliamentary drama highlights a state apparatus that seems increasingly insulated from popular suffering. The promise of economic liberation and national dignity remains unfulfilled, creating a volatile domestic environment where political anger inside Parliament can easily ignite widespread civil unrest across the nation. Take a second right now to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city or country below. South African Dynamics would like to express our deepest gratitude to everyone, sending you a heartfelt wish for strength, pride, and light on the road ahead. This systemic breakdown brings the nation face to face with an existential conflict between accountability versus impunity. For decades, the political establishment relied on procedural mechanics to maintain the appearance of democratic order, ignoring the urgent necessity for deep structural transformation. Yet, as recent events demonstrate, relying on procedural enforcement to suppress deep-seated social grievances only deepens institutional fragility. This is not law. This is not justice. Enforcement. When parliamentary rules are applied selectively to protect executive overreach while penalizing political dissent, the legitimacy of the entire legislative branch comes into question. Throughout the Julius Malema Parliament confrontations, every debate concerning intelligence oversight and ministerial accountability reveals how deeply the shadow of executive privilege obscures democratic transparency. As domestic anger mounts and the legislative deadlock deepens, the shockwaves of this parliamentary crisis are no longer contained within South Africa's borders. Diplomatic missions, foreign investors, and international bodies across the globe are watching Cape Town with growing anxiety, preparing for the geopolitical fallout of an escalating national crisis. Beyond the domestic borders of the Republic, International observers in Washington, London, and Brussels are tracking these internal developments with heightened geopolitical anxiety. As the premier economic powerhouse of the African continent and a pivotal leading voice within the expanded BRICS bloc, South Africa occupies a strategic anchor position in global trade, mineral supply chains, and South-South diplomacy. When proceedings inside the South Africa Parliament degrade into structural paralysis and bitter racial recriminations, foreign intelligence agencies and diplomatic corps recognize that the stability of the entire region hangs in the balance. For Western policymakers, the spectacle of parliamentary disorder is not treated merely as domestic political entertainment. It is analyzed as a critical indicator of institutional decay within a vital democratic ally. The escalating tensions surrounding the South Africa crisis raise profound questions across international financial markets and Western capitals regarding the long-term viability of the government of national unity and the security of foreign investments. In Washington and European capitals, major foreign policy institutions view the radical anti-imperialist rhetoric of Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters through a lens of strategic apprehension. Foreign diplomats carefully monitor Malema's uncompromising calls for land expropriation without compensation, the nationalization of key economic sectors, and an aggressive posture against Western hegemony. Mainstream international media outlets often frame these parliamentary clashes in simplified terms, focusing heavily on political sensationalism while overlooking the deep structural grievances driving popular support for the EFF. However, across the African continent and the broader global south, many regional analysts and Pan-African movements view the confrontation through a markedly different perspective. They perceive Malema's direct challenge to executive immunity not as mere disruption, but as an essential assertion of sovereign dignity, a refusal to allow post-colonial leadership to compromise African interests for Western approval. Furthermore, multilateral bodies such as the African Union and regional diplomatic forums remain keenly aware of the delicate balance required to maintain democratic governance across Southern Africa. International legal experts observe that when parliamentary mechanisms fail to address fundamental issues of justice and historic economic disparities, the legitimacy of democratic institutions risks total erosion. Foreign governments recognize that the ongoing legislative gridlock is not merely a passing political storm, but a decisive contest over who will dictate the country's economic and political destiny. Yet, as international powers weigh their diplomatic options and observe the unfolding geopolitical realignment from afar, the ultimate battleground remains firmly rooted on home soil, where a rapidly shifting domestic landscape is forcing the nation toward an inevitable crossroad. As South Africa navigates this period of intense political friction, the path forward demands far more than temporary political compromise or superficial institutional adjustments. The profound standoff inside the National Assembly exposes an undeniable reality. A nation cannot construct a resilient democratic future while resting upon unaddressed historical grievances and entrenched socio-economic divides. The governing coalition faces a defining crossroad. It can either continue relying on procedural technicalities to suppress dissenting voices, or it can directly confront the painful structural inequalities that fuel national polarization. The journey toward lasting national stability requires an uncompromising commitment to structural transformation, one that prioritizes the economic dignity of the majority alongside the institutional integrity of the constitutional state. Restoring public confidence in democratic governance depends entirely on establishing genuine mechanisms of transparency across every organ of executive power. When intelligence agencies and political principles operate behind bureaucratic protection, legislative oversight devolves into a meaningless performance. True national renewal cannot be achieved through empty promises or superficial parliamentary rulings. Not reform, not rhetoric, accountability. The Republic must construct a robust governance framework where every public official, regardless of executive status or political affiliation, remains fully subject to the supreme authority of the law and the scrutiny of the electorate. This struggle for institutional integrity is fundamentally linked to the broader conflict between silence versus voice, a relentless battle to ensure that the legitimate aspirations of ordinary citizens are amplified above the noise of party politics. Furthermore, the future trajectory of South African democracy will be determined by how effectively its leadership reconciles the imperative of economic justice with the preservation of democratic order. For the millions of young citizens demanding land redistribution and economic emancipation, political freedom without tangible economic dignity remains an incomplete legacy. Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters have successfully mobilized this widespread frustration, proving that any political settlement that ignores the material conditions of the majority will remain fundamentally fragile. To secure a peaceful and unified future, the state must forge a new social pact, one anchored in national sovereignty, equitable wealth distribution, and the unyielding protection of African dignity. Before we close, let us pause. What you have witnessed today is not simply an isolated episode of parliamentary debate. It represents an opening in Africa's unfolding story of pride, sovereignty, and independence. Each voice that joins this global conversation makes the collective chorus stronger. Subscribe to South African Dynamics now, not merely as a favor, but as a steadfast commitment to follow this crucial journey and walk with us into the next chapter of history. As the nation stands on the precipice of a new political era, one overarching question continues to echo across the continent: will South Africa's democratic institutions adapt to fulfill the promise of true liberation, or will the unresolved ghosts of its past ultimately break the state apart? What unfolded inside the National Assembly was never a simple dispute over legislative decorum or personal hostility. It stands as a profound watershed moment in South Africa's democratic journey, a stark confrontation between executive self-preservation and the unyielding demand for popular sovereignty. The explosive argument surrounding Julius Malema racist accusations lay bare the unresolved racial and economic tensions that continue to challenge the Republic 30 years after the end of apartheid. When the proceedings inside the South Africa Parliament are forced into silence by muted microphones, the deeper crisis of state accountability is exposed for the world to see. This struggle touches the very foundation of constitutional governance. True democracy cannot survive when parliamentary rules are deployed to protect political elites while suppressing the legitimate demands of the electorate. As intense public discourse regarding Julius Malema racist remarks reverberates across the country, citizens are reminded that political independence without economic dignity remains an unfulfilled promise. The nation cannot build a prosperous future by sweeping historic injustices under the carpet or treating systemic inequality as a secondary concern. Ultimately, the Republic faces an existential test of character and institutional integrity. If a nation has the vote but not the voice, is it truly a democracy? The answer will not be dictated by ministerial decrees or procedural compromises inside legislative committees. It will be forged by the courage of a sovereign people determined to reclaim their dignity, hold power accountable, and shape a future defined by justice, equality, and truth. Thank you for walking this path of rigorous analysis with South African Dynamics. Together we keep the light of truth burning bright.